Hello, this is the practice DBQ grading exercise in preparation for grading your own DBQ for Unit 9, The Rise of a Women's Rights Movement. The first thing that we're going to take a look at is contextualization because it's near the beginning of the essay normally. Some people write their thesis first, some people write their contextualization first, but generally contextualization is the background that's immediately relevant to the question itself and the topic in that question. So if we start, there's an attempt to contextualize with a throwback to Seneca Falls, which is not an incorrect way of opening an essay on women's rights, because the author wants to say this is not a new issue. It's been going on for quite some time. However, this is not immediately relevant to the essay topic, which is 1940 to 1975 women's rights. And plus, this person never really connects how the spirit of Seneca Falls actually helps ground the women in the 1940s. So they move on from that opening brief sketch of a sentence, and they don't really say anything else that is context. They're just general vague sentences about campaigning for rights. Other pressing issues got in the way. Whatever those issues are, the author never says what they are, so you don't know what they are. And then in red here, we have the final sentence of the first paragraph, which is a thesis. It's not the greatest thesis in the world. It's not the most complex thesis in the world, but it does have a claim in there, and the claim is some external developments, like war, influence the rise of the women's rights movement, internal success and awareness over equality. This is perhaps the better part of the thesis, because you could make an argument that women's rights movement really depended on raising their consciousness more than anything else to realize the nature of their oppression. So you get a point here for thesis, but you don't get a point for contextualization. Now, what could the person have done to contextualize this essay better? Well, you could have done the Cold War context, think, kitchen debate and women's domesticity. You could talk about the culture of conformity in the 1950s, the baby boom and women being chained to the household, the civil rights movement. So African Americans fighting for their own freedoms, that's a model for the feminist movement. You could also say that at the same time women are fighting for their rights, there's the counterculture and the protests of the 60s. And in that specific immediately relevant context, a women's rights movement is born. First body paragraph. So the person begins with the argument that external developments like war influenced the women's rights movement, and World War II is an important background to that. There's a historical error. The United States did not join World War II in 1945, but as long as you're in the right decade, they're not going to take the point away from you. So the first opening here is an attempt to contextualize Document 1, which is to say Document 1 occurs in the context of World War II, which was encouraging women to produce war goods. And as you see from the poster, it's an attempt to get women to join in the war effort. This particular person actually double capped Doc 1. So they did a historical context and then they did the purpose. Nothing wrong with that. Contextualizing a document and then specifically doing a kappa afterwards just means that you've increased your chances of getting all the points. The person also throws in a reference to a term, pink collar jobs. So jobs for women, which are going to increase. After World War II, jobs like secretary, teacher, nurse, for example, will show up. So that does add to the analysis in the document. The person then goes on to connect to an awareness of discrimination. So it's not just having a job, it's what's the quality of your job that makes a difference. And that person looks at Doc 2 to show that it's an expose on wage discrimination, that women are working, but they're not treated the same as men. Then the person goes on and does a purpose kappa for Doc 2, and argues that this consciousness raising helps women see their position after World War II as needing to be advanced, needing to be protected because of the discrimination, since it's not just enough to have a job. The paragraph ends with a very awkward transition to the next paragraph, and I'm not a fan of doing this. It just seems like a sentence you slap on to go, oh, and by the way, the next thing I'm going to talk about is racial equality. It's much better to make that flow if you connect it more by beginning the next paragraph with that and using it to throw back to what you said in the first paragraph. So, to summarize, this particular paragraph has at least 2 kappas that are correct that we can count. So Doc 1 and Doc 2. And Doc 1 and Doc 2 are used correctly and they're analyzed accurately. So there's 2 uses of documents that we can count there. Let's take a look at body paragraph 2, which begins with the reference to racial equality hinted at in the previous paragraph, and makes the argument that women experience the kind of discrimination that they see as parallel to African Americans and other minority groups. Then there's some hint to Doc 5 here, but there's no real analysis of what's said in Doc 5, no explanation of what Doc 5's author is trying to do or say. So that is a really poor use of the document. Then there's an attempt to say that women ask for legal protections on the basis of an executive order of affirmative action. But this is not explained or connected in any way, so it's not really clear what the person is trying to say here. What executive order of affirmative action, and what is that in reference to? So this is not a particularly good intro to Title IX. And then the person who wrote this paragraph doesn't really explain what Title IX does or what that document says. In all, this is the worst paragraph of the entire DBQ because both of the references to the documents are so vague and so shallow as to not be counted. There are also no real kappas here. Even though there's some good ideas about the parallel discrimination, none of this is really developed. So 0 on the kappas and 0 for Docs 5 and 6 because the analysis is too shallow to count. Let's look at body paragraph 3. This is an attempt to look at the counterculture as a model for the women's rights movement. So that throw back to the thesis of internal developments. There is a kappa context about the 50s as an age of conformity and the counterculture being a reaction to that, and then the women's movement taking part in that counterculture. You could read that, this particular sentence here, as a kappa context for Doc 4. But we don't have to do that, and I'll show you why in just a moment. The person mentions Doc 4 as a rebellion against Miss America, women encouraged to take part in the protest, that women are not plastic objects, which is an audience here, intended audience, kappa. Then they go on to argue that the counterculture created a pushback against stereotypes, which women are certainly doing. There is a sentence here that seems to make no sense. Counterculture was marked with hippies, drugs, and sexual permissiveness. What does that have to do with anything? Presumably in the person's mind, they were going to try to connect that to reproductive rights. You know, if the hippies are fooling around a lot, you want to have the ability to not get pregnant. But that's never directly stated. And you have to be careful when reading DBQs not to infer a person's meaning because you think you know what they're getting at. You can only judge what they actually give you. Doc 7 is then referred to next, liberty of choice, a civil rights, reproductive rights demonstration, noting that this is at a time of debates over abortion and birth control. The person does contextualize that with Roe v. Wade. I wished the person had not written stand up for their rights, because that's so vague. Roe v. Wade has a specific outcome, which is abortion rights. And you should know that, and you should actually say that and not just make it a generic reference. But the graders of this said that does count as a kappa context. So we've got 2 kappa contexts, potentially a third one. Docs 4 and 5 are used to corroborate an argument about women rejecting social standards and stereotypes. Total, overall, there are 5 kappa points that are used in this DBQ. So the graders in their grading comments said that they would use this 1950s age of conformity and counterculture as outside information, that it goes beyond the documents, since there were 2 specific kappas already in use. I always worry about that. Because I think sometimes you run the risk of, something being counted as kappa because it's so close to a document. And so I like my outside information to be in its own separate paragraph where it's unmistakable. But the graders said it was okay, so we're going to count it. Finally, a conclusion in which this person tries to extend the argument and say that the women's rights movement is very similar to the Pueblo Revolt, that women were rebelling against an exploitative caste system that considered them inferior beings. And there's a throwaway reference to Doc 3, but Doc 3 is never analyzed or explained. So that actually does not count as a doc analysis. The person then says that the women are like the Pueblo natives revolting against the Spanish. There are lots of problems with this. First of all, this attempt to connect to the Pueblo Revolt is known as a synthesis, where you're saying that 2 things in 2 different time periods are alike, and here's how they're alike. But actually, the Pueblos were not seeking equality. They were not looking to be equal to the Spanish. They were looking to get rid of the Spanish and be free. So the comparison doesn't actually work. It's not really a like situation. So you have to be careful in history when you're making these comparisons, because things might seem alike to you, but when you really start comparing them and get down to what they're fundamentally about, maybe they aren't the same after all. So here's our summary analysis for this essay. There's no contextualization point because it's not immediately relevant. There is a thesis. It's not complex, but it is a claim. There are at least 3 documents done correctly or accurately for kappa, so there's a point there. They're not written particularly well, but they counted. There are only 4 documents effectively used. You need at least 3 for a point, so they at least get a point. If you want 2 points for doc analysis, you need to use 6 documents correctly. Outside information, the 1950s counterculture, age of conformity counted here, so that's a point. And the graders gave them 1 point for argument development, that 4 docs were used to corroborate the argument, used or paired together. The attempted synthesis to the Pueblos, however, was a failure, but that's okay. They don't take points away. They just give you points for what you do right. So this is a good point here to say argument development is crucial. If you want that point, you are more likely to get it by grouping your documents together in the same paragraph and showing how they both prove the same point that you want to make. Or you can group them and say how they contrast with each other or disagree. That could still get you the argument development point as well. And they did it twice, so not just 1 attempt at it, but 2 separate paragraphs do this corroboration. So for the total, this is a 5-point DBQ. you might be thinking, how in the world? This looks terrible. This is like poorly written. You have to remember, they don't grade for grammar. They do grade with an understanding it's a timed writing. They don't take points away for mistakes if they're minor mistakes. And as long as you don't contradict yourself, as long as you don't say one thing at the beginning and a completely different thing at the end, they're going to consider you to be, making a coherent argument all the way through if you indeed do that. So judge with some leniency, but also try to hold to the standards as well as you're practicing for your DBQ grading to happen for this upcoming test. And that's it.